The White Witch by Reddit user Christian is Lost 72.
In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave to me. Even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and on one side a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. The neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly, well, most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous. As was everyone else, actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built. Many of them built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside, so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, incense are some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into another hill opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts, and spiderwebbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. Any evening Mama-san asked me to come visit with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes, and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes, and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils. Monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to military service, and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off of a cliffside, rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified, and hit with such sadness I started to cry. The sun was setting, and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember, so we never go back. She went on with her story. Any young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children. But she survived a fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable. Until the day she threw herself into the ocean, to hopefully be reunited with her lost family, but they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, the main path dotted with dim broken lights feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure. At first a bright, white shimmer. moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side, like it was moving among the crypts, and you could, actually, hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. But that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story, and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery. Not once. And I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back, to see if she's still there. Wandering the graves, looking for her children.
Japanese house ghost by Reddit user Cat Socks and Coffee.
This story isn't necessarily spooky, but it's definitely the most notable experience I've ever had that made me believe in the supernatural. I'm also posting on mobile, so please pardon any formatting issues. Back in 2015, I joined my husband, who was in the Navy at the time, in Japan. I was so excited, having been an Air Force kid, and spent a few years in Japan previously, and even more so, when I was told we were living in town, rather than on base housing. Our little house was an older style, but still fairly modern by Japanese standards, with a living dining room, toilet, and washroom downstairs, and the entire upstairs being our bedroom. We lived right by the local marina, walking distance from an aquarium and grocery store, and I was immediately in love. When I arrived, a small apartment complex was being built next door, and I got used to the sounds of work going on throughout the day, as the walls of the house and windows were fairly thin, but I was never bothered by the noises, since I spent most of the daylight hours exploring and enjoying the surrounding area, and before I knew it, construction was done. It was then I started noticing the footsteps. At first I had assumed the footsteps I was hearing were just the construction workers, until I remembered the building was done, and one day I finally realized the footsteps I was hearing was that of bare feet. If you've ever lived in a place with wood floors, you know there's a distinct sound when you walk on it barefooted versus wearing shoes. Even though the walls of the house were thin, I thought I couldn't possibly be hearing any of my neighbors, but initially gave it little thought. Then one day I was leaving the kitchen to go upstairs, and as I was approaching the hall, looking directly at the toilet room, I paused when I thought I saw the stack of toilet paper I kept stacked on the windowsill move. The window was closed, yet I saw the roll on top of the little tower, clear as day, nudge forward and fall to the floor, the sound followed by faint footsteps. A little bit freaked out, I told my husband about it when he got home, joking that maybe we had a ghost. My husband then told me that he'd witnessed something similar with a hiking stick he kept by the front door, that he'd been tying his shoes, and had looked up in time to watch the stick slowly tip forward before it fell, and admit he'd occasionally heard the footsteps too. Now, I've never considered myself religious by any means, but I was raised with a healthy respect for the dead and the possibility of spirits, so I looked into Japanese remedies to deal with potential ghosts. Since I didn't feel unsafe or necessarily uneasy in the house, I didn't think it necessary to ask the local shrine for a blessing, and, with the help of a more experienced bilingual friend, took the advice of one of the shrine maidens to hang a wind chime on the property. I picked one up from a 100-yen store, Japan's equivalent to America's Dollar General, and sure enough I stopped hearing the footsteps, and nothing fell unexpectedly after I hung it. I figured even if it was just a comforting placebo effect, I'd picked a cute chime, and it made a pretty sound, so I was happy regardless. Several months passed and the string on the chime had weathered until I eventually found it had fallen and, being made of glass, shattered. I told myself I'd grab another one while I was out in town, but it repeatedly slipped my mind as my little brother was coming for a few weeks, and I was wrapped up in my excitement and planning activities for his visit. One day while we were showing him around town, my husband pointed out a wind chime display and jokingly reminded me to get one for our resident ghost. Immediately my brother shouted, "I knew your place was haunted." He'd said this with a bit of humor, like an aha moment, but I was surprised because my husband and I were the only ones who knew about our odd experiences. Also, while I knew my brother was similarly skeptical of things, I'd always been the more superstitious one. Curious, I asked him why he thought the house was haunted. While my brother replied, "I was up late watching YouTube on my phone." He was sleeping on a futon in the living dining room, with one headphone in, and I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, I didn't see anyone there. I know I heard someone walking in the hallway, but I've seen The Grudge and knew better than to be that white person, and just went back to my phone. But I definitely heard footsteps. Since my husband and I had never considered the ghost in the house to be malicious or angry, we all got a good laugh out of my brother's animated retelling of his night, and agreed to grab a new wind chime. My brother picked one out and hung it specifically on the wall by his futon for extra luck during his stay, and confirmed nearly every morning the rest of his stay that he hadn't heard anything again. Before we left Japan, I made sure to take down the chime so the movers wouldn't pack it, hung it in the little corner garden on the property, and made a last trip to the local shrine with a friend to help me thank the shrine maiden who suggested it to me. I hope whoever moved in after us kept it in the garden, and the ghost didn't feel disrespected during our stay, because I truly loved the house and my experience there.
My Daughter's Imaginary Friend by Reddit user PKP434.
In 2013, my wife and I divorced, and we both moved into separate homes. The divorce went well, and we are still good friends to this day, partly because we have a daughter together. We agreed to split custody over our daughter, and I rented an old house in a historic district in the city where we live. It was a very pretty home, built in 1935, but kept up very well. I would have my daughter 2 weeks at a time, and she had a bedroom in the back of the house. She was 3 years old at the time, and I kept noticing her talking to her friend. One day I found her in a little closet talking to someone, and I remember her saying she was talking to another little girl named Betty. I have no idea where she heard the name Betty, as she was only 3 years old, but I just chalked it all up to a child's vivid imagination. Keep in mind, I am a single dad to a little girl. I really have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to dressing, hair, or just little girl stuff in general. Her mother is good at that stuff, but not me. I put my daughter to bed one night after her bath. I remember brushing her hair that night, but that was all I did. The very next morning, her mom came to pick her up from my house, and my daughter was just waking up. Her mom went back to her bedroom to find my daughter's hair was fixed in 2 perfect French braids. Her mom was really proud of me at first, that I had done her hair so cute, but I told her I didn't and couldn't do that. I can't even braid her hair, much less do perfect French braids. We asked our daughter how her hair got fixed, and she told us that Betty had done it during the night. I broke the contract on the rental agreement and moved out within the next month.
Bought my first house and found out it was haunted by Reddit user Mickey M Ball 0664.
I bought my first house in 2003 and was over the moon. Shortly after moving in, 2 of my neighbors began joking with me about the ghost in my house. Well, I thought they were joking, so I just played along pretending I had seen one, and it was no big deal. Well, as time went on that summer, I met more and more of my neighbors, and they all brought up the same topic. Finally, an elderly woman on the block who was quite kind and friendly told me a story after I'd asked her. I knew she wasn't going to screw with my head, which is why I asked in the first place. Turned out the previous owner purchased the home and never lived there because she said it was haunted. Sounds in the night of footsteps and sobbing, and glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen covered in blood. One of my neighbors helped with the renovations of the house and said that he was putting up drywall when he felt something lift up his dreadlocks. Though I've had paranormal experiences before, it had been years, and by then I just chalked it up to night terrors. One day I went to a small neighborhood video store to rent a movie. I had to fill out a form with my demographic data and then my credit card info. The owner of the store looked at the form and said, "Oh my God, you live in that house." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that her former employee had committed suicide in my house. She came to the house as soon as she'd heard, but the house had been taped off by police as a potential crime scene. She told me that he had just moved into the house with his partner and called his mom because he wanted to invite her over to meet his partner and come out to her. This was in the early 90s, when being gay was a big deal. His mother already knew he was gay because he bought a house with a man and disowned him right over the phone. That same week he received a letter from an HIV testing center stating he had tested positive for HIV. This is when HIV was a death sentence. He then sat at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since then, she has had multiple paranormal experiences in the store, with videos flying off shelves and even levitating off shelves. The most I have experienced is sounds at night, sounds of Cheerios being poured into a bowl one don't eat cereal, and sounds of sobbing in the kitchen. I often awaken to both. I remember my grandmother saying, when the dead come to you, they want something, perform an act of charity in their name, and pray for them. So I did. I sat down at the kitchen table one night and lit a candle and told him that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him before a lit candle. On the 9th night of the first novena to Saint Anthony, patron saint of lost souls, I heard uncontrollable sobbing. I felt a strong presence of grief and despair, and the sound of hyperventilating breathing, as though someone could not catch their breath. I sat in the presence of this, knowing it was not malignant, but rather a connection of intimacy and compassion, of which he was in need. For 45 days I said a novena prayer before a lit candle for his soul, and had a mass said in his name. A few times I had awakened to feel his presence standing over my bed, but knew it was not a malignant presence. This still happens from time to time, but less and less frequently.
My grandma's house is haunted by Reddit user Abby Kadabi.
My grandma's house has always, for as long as I can remember, been a scary place. My dad and aunt and uncle all grew up in the house and had paranormal experiences occur throughout their lives. One example was when my dad and uncle were teenagers. My uncle was walking down the steps and was swinging a towel. As he had just washed his hair, out of nowhere my dad, who was standing in the living room at the bottom of the stairs, saw the towel straighten out in front of my uncle, as if someone pulled it, and my uncle fell forcefully down the stairs. Now, my grandma hates all things paranormal, especially Ouija boards, and she would often visit gypsies. So it is a big no-no in our family to discuss the paranormal events that occur in her house. 20 years or so ago, my cousins and brothers were playing in the upstairs bedrooms of my grandparents' house. The toys were set up in the room across the hall from them, and they were all in the same bedroom playing a board game. Out of nowhere, a Hot Wheels car, no batteries, no wind-up, just an average Hot Wheels car, slowly exited the room that the toys were in, went across the hall, and into the room where they were all sitting. Needless to say, they were all terrified. Around 8 years ago, my oldest brother moved into the basement of their house. One night when he was home alone, he woke up out of a deep sleep, having felt like he was shaken by someone. He stood up and instantly smelled gas. He went upstairs and outside of the house. Later he found out there was a carbon monoxide leak, and if he had not woken up, there's a big chance he could have died in his sleep. Months after that, when my grandparents were away for the weekend, the family decided to try the Ghost Radar app in their house. We all sat around the phone, and my uncle asked the normal questions: is anyone here, blah blah. Then he asked who used to live in the basement. At this point my brother had moved out. The Ghost Radar replied with my brother's full first name, which no one ever calls him. We were shocked. So my uncle asked, "How did you save my brother?" It replied with "Wig. WTF. He then asked, "What did you save him from?" And it said gas. Bro. Needless to say, we were shocked. The last thing that I'm going to talk about that happens in the house is my grandparents' friend's obituary, who passed away probably 15 years ago, will show up in their kitchen every month or so. They usually say hello to their friend and put the obituary back in the basement, where it is supposed to stay low. A little while later it will show back up in the kitchen.